Bloodborne is an amazing game. The world is dark and gothic but oddly beautiful at times. The lore is deep and intriguing, showing a deeper level to certain characters that we didn't think too much of at first, and the combat is fantastic, turning the already iconic Souls formula and injected it with meth. The game now requires a more aggressive approach in fights, and also your character moves at a faster pace. I mean, bro doesn't even roll, they literally launched himself across the arena at a swift pace, which looks really cool. Again, all these things makes Bloodborne a truly phenomenal game. But is it a masterpiece though? Nah. Okay, just hear me out. When I say that Bloodborne isn't a masterpiece, I don't mean it in a way like, oh, you think it's a masterpiece, but I don't, therefore it's not. Nah, again, I think the game is phenomenal, but to me it's definitely not the best work that FromSoft has put out. Again, at least to me. And this is coming from someone who has Bloodborne high up as one of the best games of all time. So to clarify even more, this video isn't about me bitching about Bloodborne and taking a dump on it, because I don't know, I got manhandled by the Orphan of Cause or something. Now it's more so that I just got done playing it on my PC and just wanted to go over the many great things about the game, but also acknowledging its flaws as well. Because while the game has many great things going for it, it definitely has its fair share of faults. So bear with me as I go over the good and bad of Bloodborne and what it could have done for it to be even better. You can't talk about Bloodborne without bringing up the world and atmosphere. It's literally the biggest thing that sets it apart from the other Souls games. No more large sprawling castles and knights in shiny armor. Instead we have Victorian era architecture, and instead of knights we have hunters, who give up all protection for the sake of agility and drip. I mean, you can't blame them cause the fit does look tough. The world of Bloodborne is dark, mysterious, and full of horror, but that's what makes it so great. From the moment you step into Yharnam, you feel like you've entered a nightmare. The streets are filled with beasts, eerie lights flicker in the distance, and the sound of distant screams keeps you on edge. The world isn't just scary though, it definitely has its, beautiful moments in its own weird, twisted, haunting way. One of the best things about Bloodborne's world is how it tells a story through its environment. Just like how the other Souls games do their story, Bloodborne lets you figure things out on your own. The ruined buildings, abandoned clinics, and bloodstained streets all hint at the tragic history of Yharnam and the people's addiction to that good old blood. The game's atmosphere is also one of its strongest points. Everything in Bloodborne is designed to make you feel uneasy. The gothic architecture, the chilling, haunting soundtrack, and the unsettling enemy designs all work together to create a sense of dread. Even if you're in a safe area, you never feel truly comfortable. The game keeps you on edge by making sure danger is always around the corner, and the lighting is also used to great effect as well, as some areas are completely dark, forcing you to move carefully. One thing I really like about the world is how it changes as you progress through the story. At first, when we start at Central Yharnam, it feels like for most of the journey you'll be finding beasts in the city, but as you progress, the game starts to take you through different areas like the Forbidden Forest and the various nightmares, which are big shifts from the town setting. But what's even better is how the game unveils the secret of the world as you go on. Again, for most of the game you're fighting mutated beasts to holy shit, what am I looking at? Again, the world of Bloodborne is just amazing, and it was a nice change from what we were so used to in the previous games. Another thing that you can't leave out when talking about Bloodborne is the combat. As I said earlier in this video, the combat is basically a methed up version of Dark Souls. What I like is that while in the Souls games you feel like an ordinary human trying to survive in the world, in Bloodborne you feel like a super soldier on a duty. It rewards an aggressive playstyle instead of cowering behind a shield like a little bit. Okay, I'm just playing. If you use a shield in the other games, then shout out to you. How the game rewards aggression is by making the hunter fast enough to keep up with the bosses. Dodging and evading in this game is done by quick step instead of rolling, which is good because it makes getting back into the action after evading an attack much faster. Instead of waiting for the boss to do a 50 hit combo just for you to barely get a hit in. But the true main way the game rewards an aggressive playstyle is with the rally mechanic. So in Bloodborne, every time you get hit, for a short period of time you can regain a portion of the health you've lost by landing hits on the enemies. This is really great for adrenaline junkies who just, want to turn off their brains and go ham on a boss. The second best thing about the combat is the parrying. Parrying in Bloodborne doesn't involve a shield like the rest of the games, but instead a gun. This makes parrying a bit more fun and cooler, even though it can make some bosses pushovers, as the parry windows are surprisingly forgiving. But it doesn't take away from how engaging it makes the combat feels. Now the last thing that makes the combat feel great is the trick weapons. You see, unlike other titles, Bloodborne doesn't have the typical weapon categories like straight swords, great swords, spears, etc. Instead, you have weapons that can basically transform into other weapons. like Ludwig's Holy Blade, which can transform from a longsword to a greatsword when combined with its sheath. This is really fun and it makes up for the less amount of weapons you have in the game, as each of them are basically two combined. With this, you also have unique transforming combos with each of the weapons. But despite how much I love the trick weapon system, there's something that holds it back for me, and it's a very small issue thankfully, but the main gripe I have with it is just how little some of the other weapons interested me. This might be because the game only has around 25 weapons, which makes the selection of my favorites being significantly lower than the other titles. However, again, this is just a slight issue. Now, please don't take this as me saying the game having a small amount of weapons is a bad thing, as I truly understand why it only has a few. But that aside, I do really enjoy the combat of this game. Now, another part of the game that elevates the overall experience for me is the DLC. The Old Hunters DLC is considered by many to be the second best or outright best DLC in FromSoft history, and while I wouldn't consider it as my number one favorite, I definitely understand why many people think highly of it. This is still one of the best DLCs I've ever played. The scenery, the music, the bosses, everything about it is magnificent, except for Lawrence. You suck. Now let's start with the art direction and atmosphere. The Old Hunters take place in the Hunter's Nightmare, which is this dark and twisted version of some of the areas that were in the base game and some areas that were mentioned in the lore. The base game of Bloodborne has its horror-esque moments, but the areas in the DLC really dials things up to 11. Everything just looks crooked and inverted, which definitely adds to the dreaded atmosphere. Now let's talk about the bosses inside the DLC. First up, we have Ludwig the Accursed, who is one of the best bosses in the entire game. The music, design, and atmosphere really makes him super fun and engaging. Oh, and don't forget the lore behind him as well. The second boss encounter is a bit less exciting and memorable, as it's just the living failures, but right after them you have Lady Maria, who is my favorite boss in the entire game. And after defeating her, you get to explore the fishing hamlet, which plays a big part in the story of the DLC, as it's where Gehrman and the other hunters kill Koss, which is a great one, and it's also where many people were slaughtered and dissected. Also just love the scenery of this area. I don't know, it's just weird. I don't know, I just love it. And speaking of Koss, the final boss of the DLC is her orphaned son, which to this day still makes a really challenging fight. Oh yeah, and you have Lawrence as well. I forgot about him, and rightfully so. The DLC also has my favorite weapon, which is the Whirligig Saw. I don't care if it's cheesy or broken, this is straight up the best weapon in the entire game. All in all, the bosses, atmosphere, and setting are the main reasons why I love this DLC. Now, I'm not gonna lie, the DLC did kinda save Bloodborne for me, mostly because of how lackluster the main game boss lineup was. So having a cool change of setting plus some new and interesting bosses made the game more enjoyable, especially on subsequent playthroughs. And you know what, since we're talking about mediocre boss lineup, let's talk about the faults of the game. Now, one of the things that bothered me the most when it comes down to Bloodborne is this very lacking main game boss lineup. A lot of the bosses in the main game, to put it simply, are just mid, especially on subsequent playthroughs. The reason why I say this is because on a first playthrough, the bosses are obviously going to be a bit cooler, if you know what I mean. Like, their presence just stand out a bit more. And I know you might be thinking that obviously bosses are going to seem more boring on subsequent playthroughs, but what if I told you that's not always the case? Most of my favorite bosses weren't that fun to me at first, mostly because I either fought them at a lower level or just not having the full understanding of the game's mechanics. But on each new playthrough, after fighting them over and over, they became way more fun. Melania is an example of this. Man, I hated her so much at first, but over time she grew on to me and she's now in my personal top 5. Okay, I'm getting a little off topic here, but all that aside, Bloodborne's base game does have some good bosses. Unfortunately, they are few and far between. Not saying the rest are bad, but they're just really mid in my opinion. I mean, the game starts off pretty strong with the Cleric Beast and Father Gascoigne, two banger fights back to back. Then the next encounter is a Bloodstarved Beast, which I mean is kinda mid, but can definitely get a pass due to it being after two banger fights. Then we have Vicar Amelia, who definitely stands out a little bit, but not that fun to fight, mostly because of the awkward camera. Then we go downhill from here. After Amelia, you have the Witches of Hemwick, which is a straight up ass, Ligarius, who isn't bad but not a super fun fight, Shadows of Yharnam, which again, not a bad boss, but definitely isn't super memorable either, Rom the Spider, who is just bullshit, Dark Beast Parl, which is actually pretty decent, One Reborn, extremely boring, Mikolash, who's just straight up dog shit, Murgo's Wet Nurse, who's not bad, but let's be honest, she's not all that memorable either, but still at least washes away the bad taste on Mikolash left. Then after that we have a phenomenal fight with Gehrman, and then we have a somewhat okay fight with Moon Presence. who I wish had a better second phase. So out of all the bosses I listed in the base game, only around 3 of them stood out to me in a super positive light. Again, this is all up to personal taste. Shit, maybe someone out there loves the Witches of Hemwick and think that they're the best boss FromSoft has ever made. Just letting you know, if you genuinely think that, then something might be wrong with you. But you can see why many fans have been saying that the boss lineup is a bit, meh. But to be fair, the games before had a lot of extremely mediocre bosses as well, like Dark Souls 2, so going from that to Bloodborne is definitely a major step in the right direction. But again, the bosses, especially compared to the modern Souls game standards, were, again, pretty lacking. Now let's shift our focus from the bosses and talk about another flaw that the game have, and that's the weird healing system. I don't care what anyone say, they could have definitely handled the blood vial system way better. At least have us recover with like 5 or something. Or make the prices remain the same instead of charging us extra in the mid to late game. But more so in a way where it's less frustrating. Like, I hate having to farm or buy heals every time just because I lost to a boss or whatever. It sucks. Again, the blood vials themselves are great healing items. They're fast and you can carry plenty. But again, the fact that you have to farm them is a bit tedious. Another small but very inconvenient nitpick I have is about the lamp system. Why couldn't they just give us the option to fast travel from lamp to lamp in the game instead of having to go inside the hunter's dream, waiting for the game to load, then go pick the area where you want to go, then wait for the game to load again. Like, maybe they thought that lore wise you can only fast travel from the dream itself, but I call bullshit. This is the same game where we fight aliens that can shoot stars out of their asshole. You can at least give us the option to fast travel lamp to lamp. I mean, Dark Souls 2 and even Dark Souls 1 gave this option, so why they didn't in this game is a bit confusing. I don't know why this option wasn't given because I'm pretty sure even Dark Souls 2 gave the option to reallocate your stats, so it was quite surprising to find out you can't actually do this in Bloodborne. Meaning whatever stats you put in will permanently be there. On one hand, you can look at this as a way of the game telling you to be more careful with what stats you level up, but on the other, it's still kind of annoying knowing that if you're midway through the game on a strength build, you have to commit to that build until New Game Plus. Like, come on, I can't be the only one that was annoyed by this. And this hurt me even more because a lot of the cooler weapons are in the late game and DLC. And the last nitpick I have about the game is the jump button. Whose idea was it to put jump and dodge on the same button? Like, what? The amount of times I accidentally jumped instead of dodge was quite frustrating. I know that you have to stop the running momentum and then press dodge afterwards, but even when I did this, there was still a slight delay. Also, there's barely any point in an encounter where you can just go like, oh, let me just stop for a moment and dodge. Like, what? That sounds like a recipe for disaster. So not a super big deal, but man, it was frustrating at times. Now, there are some other things that I could have mentioned, like the Chalice dungeons or the Blood Gem system, but personally, I don't think they stand out too much, especially since they don't hinder the main game itself. And also, you can still find decent Blood Gems within the base game and DLC, so you don't always have to go through a long list of steps in order to make your build viable. Overall, while I still believe that Bloodborne is an amazing game that deserves its flowers, the few faults that it has holds it back from being a masterpiece in my eyes. Especially when it comes on to the very boring main game lineup of bosses. If the game didn't have the quote unquote faults I've mentioned, it would have definitely been a masterpiece to me. Now again, I do want to reiterate that not because I don't think it's a masterpiece, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't think of it as one. This is just my opinion, but still, you can feel free to disagree, and I would actually like to hear in the comments whether you disagreed or agreed with my points. But all in all, that's the end of the video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. If not, then that's fine by me. Anyways, I hope you have a good one, and that's it.